The dust of the auction yard tasted of desperation, a fine grit coating Elias's tongue, settling in the lines etched deep around his eyes by sun and sorrow. He stood apart, a solitary figure in worn denim and faded canvas, his shadow long and stark in the pitiless afternoon light. The air thrummed with a nervous energy, the low murmur of bids, the auctioneer's sharp, rhythmic patter, a hammer driving nails into coffins of hope. Before him, on a rough-hewn platform, stood the three women. They were not livestock, yet the stench of the nearby cattle pen seemed to cling to them, a miasma of despair and forced submission. The first, Ilara, held herself with a rigid stillness, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, her face a mask of hard-won composure, though a tremor in her tightly clasped hands betrayed the storm within. Beside her, Maeve, younger, smaller, seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal, her shoulders hunched as if against an expected blow. The third, Sarah, was an enigma of quietude, her head slightly bowed, dark hair veiling her expression, her presence a study ineffable sorrow, yet with an undercurrent of something watchful, resilient. Elias watched them, not with the leer of some, nor the calculating appraisal of others, but with a hollowness in his chest that mirrored their own. His ranch, his legacy, was crumbling, turning to dust like the parched land around it. He needed hands, yes, but more, he felt an ache for something to anchor him, a reason to fight the encroaching wilderness that threatened to swallow him whole. The bids were desultory, tinged with a kind of shame that no one voiced. These were not the robust, sought-after offerings. These were the leftovers of misfortune, women stripped of everything but the breath in their lungs. He heard his own voice, rough and unfamiliar, cut through the stale air. A number. Higher than he intended, a sum scraped from the very marrow of his dwindling resources. A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The auctioneer's gavel cracked, a sound as final as a gunshot. 3 lives, bound to his by a handful of silver and a public declaration of ownership. He felt no triumph, only the weight of their gazes, unseen but palpable, pressing down on him like the immense, indifferent sky. The setting sun bled crimson across the horizon as he led them away, a silent, somber procession, the taste of dust and desperation still clinging to them all. The wagon creaked a mournful rhythm beneath them, its wheels grinding against the rutted track that led away from the raw wound of the auction town. Elias kept his eyes on the weary backs of his horses, their hides dusted the same rust red as the parched earth. Behind him, the 3 women sat in a silence as vast and unyielding as the landscape unfolding around them. Ilara maintained her stony composure, her spine straight against the jolting of the wagon, her gaze fixed on the receding horizon as if willing herself to unsee what lay ahead. Maeve huddled into a corner, her small frame trembling with each bump, tears tracking silently through the grime on her cheeks, a choked sob occasionally escaping her lips like a wounded bird. Sarah, still veiled by her curtain of dark hair, seemed to sway with the wagon's motion, an almost fluid acceptance of the inevitable, yet her hands, clasped in her lap, were white-knuckled. The air was thick with unspoken fear, with the residue of trauma, with the raw, gaping wound of their exchanged humanity. Elias offered no words of comfort, for what comfort could be found in such a transaction? His own heart was a leaden weight, his mind a turmoil of doubt and a grim, unyielding sense of responsibility. He had not sought this, not truly. He had sought a reprieve from solitude, a desperate gamble against the encroaching ruin of his ranch, but the reality of their presence, their tangible fear and fragility, was a heavier burden than he had anticipated. The land itself seemed to reflect their plight, stark, unforgiving, broken by ravines and dotted with skeletal trees clawing at the sky. Yet, even here, a stubborn resilience asserted itself, a patch of wildflowers clinging to a rocky outcrop, the tenacious green of scrub clinging to life in the arid soil. He thought of his ranch, of the dry well and the fallow fields, of the silence that had become his only companion. He had bought them, yes, an act that tasted bitter as gall, but a deeper, unacknowledged instinct stirred within him, a need to shelter, to shield these broken lives from further harm, even if he himself was a source of their present dread. As the shadows lengthened and the air grew chill, the distant, rugged outline of his homestead appeared, a dark silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, promising not welcome, but a harsh, uncertain sanctuary. The sun, a molten coin, dipped below the jagged line of the western hills, painting the sky in hues of blood and ash. Inside the small, sparsely furnished cabin, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and an unspoken tension that vibrated like a taut wire. A single lantern cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls, elongating figures, deepening hollows. Elias had procured a circuit preacher in the last fading light, a man whose eyes held a weary understanding of human desperation, his words brief, devoid of flourish, a stark recitation of vows that felt more like a sentence than a sacrament. The women stood before him, their faces pale in the dim light, their responses whispered, barely audible. Elara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, Maeve's was a choked breath, Sarah's, a mere murmur, lost almost before it was spoken. There were no rings, no celebratory meal, no witnesses save the silent, watchful land outside. It was a binding, stark and unadorned, a legal necessity in a world that offered few protections, yet it felt like a profanation, a further stripping away of dignity. When the preacher had departed, his fee a meager offering from Elias's dwindling store, an even deeper silence descended. Elias gestured towards the two narrow cots he had set up in the main room, covered with clean but patched blankets. "These are for you," he said, his voice raspy, unaccustomed to such pronouncements. He himself would take the worn pallet by the cold hearth. He offered them the last of his bread and a canteen of water, placing it on the rickety table between the cots. He made no demands, issued no orders. He simply retreated to his own space, turning his back to give them what little privacy the small cabin afforded. He could hear their movements, small, rustling sounds, the creak of a cot, a stifled sniffle that might have been Maeve. He lay staring into the darkness, the weight of their presence, their fear, their unknown pasts, pressing down on him. He was their husband in name, their purchaser by law, but in the desolate quiet of that first night, he felt only like their reluctant jailer, bound to them by an act of desperation that had irrevocably altered the course of all their lives. The wind moaned outside, a mournful chorus to the silent anguish within. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin's single grimy window, a pale, hesitant intruder. Elias was already awake, had been for hours, the cold seeping from the stone hearth into his bones. He rose quietly, his movements economical, born of long habit and a desire not to disturb the fragile quiet. He built a small fire, the crackle of kindling a small rebellion against the oppressive silence. He made coffee, the aroma sharp and familiar, a small comfort in the starkness of the morning. He set out 3 chipped mugs, along with the remainder of the bread. He did not look towards the cots where the women lay, feigning sleep or perhaps truly lost in an exhausted oblivion. He took his own mug and stepped outside, into the chill air. The land stretched before him, vast and indifferent, the eastern sky slowly blushing with the promise of another harsh day. His tasks were many, the work unending, the reward uncertain. He checked on his few remaining cattle, their ribs showing, their eyes dull. He mended a section of broken fence, his hands moving with practiced skill, his mind a turmoil. When he returned to the cabin hours later, the sun higher, the air warming, he found the cots empty. The bread was untouched, the coffee cold. Elara stood by the window, her back to the room, gazing out at the unforgiving landscape as if searching for an escape that did not exist. Maeve was curled on one of the cots, her face buried in the blanket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah sat at the small table, her hands resting limply in her lap, her dark hair still obscuring her face, but her posture was one of profound stillness, not of fear, but of waiting. Elias said nothing. He refilled his mug with cold coffee, took a piece of bread, and ate standing by the door, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He would not force them. He would not command. He had brought them here, and the weight of that act was his to bear. He could offer them shelter, such as it was, and sustenance. The rest, if anything was to come of this bleak arrangement, would have to unfold in its own time, in its own way. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by Maeve's muffled weeping and the distant caw of a crow. Days bled into one another, each marked by the sun's relentless journey across the vast, empty sky. Elias rose before dawn, tending to the endless, thankless tasks of a failing ranch. He moved with a quiet determination, his energy focused, his interactions with the women minimal, almost non-existent. He left food on the table, a meager rations of beans, dried meat, occasionally a few tough vegetables from a neglected patch near the cabin. He spoke only when necessity demanded, his words brief, unadorned. He expected nothing, demanded nothing. He worked. He endured. And he watched. Elara was the first to stir from their collective inertia. She began by cleaning the small cabin with a fierce, almost desperate energy, scrubbing the grime from the floors, washing the few pitiful garments they possessed in the creek that trickled nearby. Her movements were sharp, efficient, her face set in lines of grim resolve. She did not speak to Elias, did not acknowledge his presence beyond a fleeting, unreadable glance. Maeve remained withdrawn, a shadow flitting at the edges of their small, shared existence. She ate little, her eyes perpetually wide with a hunted look. She would often retreat to the creek bed, sitting for hours, staring into the slow-moving water, her small hands twisting a piece of grass or a smooth stone. Elias left her to her solitude, sensing a grief too profound for clumsy words. Sarah was the quietest, the most observant. She moved with a ghost-like grace, her presence often unnoticed until she was suddenly there. Her dark eyes, when glimpsed, held a depth that was unsettling, a knowing that seemed far beyond her years. One afternoon, Elias found her by the neglected vegetable patch, her slender fingers gently clearing away weeds from around a few struggling tomato plants. She did not look up as he approached, her focus absolute. He said nothing, merely left a rusty hoe leaning against the cabin wall later that day. The next morning, he saw that the patch had been cleared, the soil loosened around the thirsty plants. No words were exchanged, but a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a fragile thread in the vast emptiness. The ranch remained a place of hardship, the future a bleak uncertainty, but within the cabin's walls, subtle shifts were occurring, the slow, almost imperceptible thawing of frozen hearts. A storm gathered in the west, a bruised purple stain spreading across the sky, mirroring the unspoken anxieties within the small cabin. The wind rose, a low moan at first, then a keening howl that rattled the ill-fitting windowpane and whistled through the cracks in the walls. Elias worked frantically to secure what little he had, reinforcing the lean-to that sheltered his cattle, checking the roof of the cabin, his movements urgent against the fading light. The women watched him from the doorway, their faces pale and apprehensive. Elara's usual composure was strained, her hands clenched at her sides. Maeve had begun to weep openly, her fear a palpable thing in the charged air. Even Sarah's stillness seemed to carry a new tension. As the first drops of rain, heavy and cold, began to fall, a loud crack echoed from the direction of the creek, the sound of a large cottonwood branch, weakened by drought, succumbing to the wind's fury. One of his few remaining calves, startled, had bolted towards the trees lining the swollen creek. Without a word, Elias grabbed a rope and plunged into the driving rain, his figure quickly swallowed by the growing darkness. He could hear the panicked bellows of the calf, the roar of the wind. He fought his way through the whipping branches, the mud sucking at his boots. The women remained at the cabin door, shadows against the dim lamplight. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he finally stumbled back, soaked to the bone, mud-caked and exhausted, he was carrying the trembling calf in his arms. He laid it gently by the hearth, its small body shivering. As he straightened, his gaze met Elara's. Her face was unreadable in the flickering light, but for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a spark of something other than fear or resentment. Maeve had stopped crying, her wide eyes fixed on the rescued animal. Sarah had quietly brought a dry sackcloth and laid it beside the calf. No words were spoken, but as the storm raged outside, a different kind of silence settled within the cabin, less oppressive, touched by a shared experience, a moment where survival had briefly, silently, united them against the indifferent fury of the elements. The wind still howled, but inside, the small flame in the hearth cast a warmer, more hopeful light. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the land lay washed clean, glistening under a tentative sun. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and bruised sage. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to assert itself in new ways around the small homestead. Sarah, with a quiet diligence that was becoming her hallmark, coaxed the struggling vegetable patch into a semblance of order. She carried water from the creek, her movements unhurried, graceful. Elias, observing her from a distance as he mended a harness, saw her pause one morning to touch a newly unfurled tomato leaf, a fleeting, almost tender gesture. He found an old, chipped enamel basin and left it near the patch, filled with water. The next day, it was empty, the soil around the plants dark and moist. Maeve, too, began to emerge from her shell of fear. She started by helping Elara with small tasks around the cabin, sweeping the floor, washing the few dishes. Her movements were still hesitant, her eyes often downcast, but the constant trembling had eased. One afternoon, Elias heard a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed, a soft, tentative humming. It was Maeve, sitting on the cabin step, mending a tear in her worn dress, her voice a fragile melody against the vast silence of the plains. Elara remained the most guarded, her reserve a fortress built of past hurts. Yet, even she began to thaw. She took over the cooking, her skills with their meager provisions surprisingly adept, transforming beans and dried meat into palatable, if simple, meals. She still rarely spoke directly to Elias, but her presence at the table, the way she divided the food, carried a sense of order, of grudging acceptance. Elias continued his relentless work, the rhythm of his days unchanged, but he was no longer entirely alone in his struggle. He found a small, intricately woven circlet of wildflowers on the rough sill of his window one morning, left there like a silent offering. He didn't know who had placed it there, perhaps Sarah, with her quiet connection to the earth, or Maeve, with her emerging lightness. He left it untouched, a fragile symbol of an unspoken shift, a tiny bloom of hope in the barren landscape of their lives. The isolation of the ranch was a double-edged sword, a shield from the harsh judgments of the world, but also a constant reminder of their vulnerability. One sun-scorched afternoon, the rhythmic clang of Elias's hammer against metal was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. His hand stilled, his body tensing. Strangers were a rarity, and rarely a good omen. He saw the women freeze near the cabin, Elara pulling Maeve slightly behind her, Sarah's head lifting with a sudden, alert stillness. Two men on horseback rode into the yard, their faces hard, their eyes cold and appraising. One was the auctioneer, his smile a thin, predatory slash. The other was a burly, unpleasant-looking man Elias didn't recognize. "Just checking on my investment, Thorn," the auctioneer called out, his voice slick with false congeniality. "Making sure your property is settling in." His gaze lingered on the women with an insolence that made Elias's blood run cold. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and the cabin, his stance unassuming but rooted, like an old, weathered oak. "They're fine," he said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous calm in its depths. "This is my land." "My business," the second man snorted. "Heard you got yourself a bargain. Maybe you'd be willing to share the wealth, rancher." "One of them looks like she might remember me," his eyes fixed on Maeve, who shrank further, a small, choked sound escaping her. Elias didn't move, didn't raise his voice. But something in his stillness, in the unwavering intensity of his gaze, gave the men pause. The air crackled with unspoken menace. "There's nothing for you here," Elias stated, his voice flat, final. Ride out. For a long moment, no one moved. The auctioneer's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. He exchanged a look with his companion, a silent calculation. Then, with a curt nod, he reined his horse around. "Have it your way, Thorn." For now they rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a renewed sense of unease. Elias watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. When he turned back, Elara was looking at him, her expression complex, a mixture of fear, surprise, and something else, something akin to a dawning, reluctant respect. He had stood as a barrier, a silent protector, and in that moment, the nature of their strange, unwilling bond had subtly, irrevocably, shifted. The encounter with the auctioneer and his brutish companion left a lingering chill, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their sanctuary. Yet, paradoxically, it also seemed to forge a new, unspoken solidarity among the cabin's inhabitants. The silences between them, once heavy with fear and mistrust, now held a different quality, a shared understanding of vulnerability, a mutual reliance born of necessity and shared hardship. Elias noticed subtle changes. Maeve, though still timid, no longer flinched at his approach. She even offered him a hesitant smile one morning when he praised the small, neatly mended patch on his worn shirt, a task she had undertaken unasked. Sarah continued her quiet ministrations in the garden, and sometimes, in the evenings, Elias would see her sketching in the dirt with a stick, intricate patterns that seemed to hold a secret language. He left a stub of charcoal and a few pieces of flattened bark near her usual spot, and the next day, they were gone. Elara remained the most reserved, but even her formidable defenses showed tiny cracks. She began to leave a portion of the evening meal warming by the hearth for him if his work kept him out late. She still rarely met his eye, but the harshness in her own gaze had softened, replaced by a weary acknowledgement of their shared existence. One evening, as they sat around the table for their meager meal, a comfortable silence had settled. Elias, looking at the three women, saw not just the purchased brides, the remnants of tragedy, but individuals, each bearing their scars, yet each demonstrating a quiet resilience he found himself increasingly admiring. Elara, her spine straight, her hands clasped in her lap after the meal, her gaze distant but no longer entirely closed off. Maeve, tracing patterns on the rough wooden table with her finger, a faint, almost wistful expression on her face. Sarah, her dark hair slightly pulled back, revealing a glimpse of a thoughtful, intelligent countenance as she listened to the chirping of crickets outside. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the quiet room. "The well," he said, his voice raspy. "It's low. But there's a spring, higher up. Needs clearing." Hard work he wasn't asking, not commanding. Simply stating a fact, a problem. Elara met his gaze directly for the first time, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "We can help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Maeve and Sarah nodded in silent assent. It was a small moment, a simple exchange, but it felt like a turning point, the first fragile cornerstone of something new being laid upon the ruins of their pasts. The work on the spring was arduous, demanding. The path was overgrown, the spring itself choked with rocks and debris. Elias toiled from sunup to sundown, his muscles aching, his hands raw. And beside him, the women worked. Elara, surprisingly strong, hauled rocks with a grim determination, her movements efficient, her focus unwavering. Maeve, though smaller, carried water and smaller stones, her initial timidity giving way to a quiet persistence. Sarah, with her keen eye, found the easiest paths, identified the loosest earth, her contribution subtle but invaluable. They worked in tandem, often without words, communicating through shared effort, through the rhythm of their labor. Sweat stung Elias's eyes, mingling with the dust of the dry earth. He watched them, these women he had bought, now partners in a struggle for survival, for a future that was still a distant, uncertain shimmer on the horizon. There were moments of shared hardship, a near fall, a stubborn root that refused to yield, that brought forth a gruff word of warning from Elias, a quick, steadying hand from Elara, a shared glance of exasperation that almost, bordered on a shared, silent laugh. In the evenings, exhaustion settled over them, a heavy blanket, but it was the satisfying ache of labor shared, of purpose found. The cabin felt different, less a prison, more a refuge. The meals, though still simple, tasted better, seasoned with the salt of their collective effort. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, as they sat by the small fire, Maeve began to hum a low, sweet melody. Sarah, after a moment, picked up a smooth stone and tapped out a gentle rhythm against another. Elias found himself leaning back against the rough cabin wall, the weariness in his bones profound, yet accompanied by a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace. He looked at their faces, softened by the firelight, etched with fatigue but also with a quiet dignity, a resilient strength. The world outside was still harsh, their past still haunted them, but here, in this small, isolated patch of earth, something fragile and precious was taking root. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps never in the conventional sense. But it was connection. It was a shared breath. It was the quiet triumph of endurance, the stubborn, tenacious hope for a new dawn, not just for the parched land, but for the parched souls who tended it. The sun rose the next morning on a clearer spring, the water trickling more freely, a silver ribbon of promise in the harsh landscape.